Alright, hey guys, welcome back. So today we're going to look at a variation on reaction diffusion, or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what to call this, but it started with reaction diffusion, and you guys can decide what you want to call it. Basically, this effect is starting with reaction diffusion, but I really wanted to focus on adding a little bit more interest and variety using some different parameters because reaction diffusion is cool and I love having some of the organic textures to play with. But one thing that I find a lot of times when working with reaction diffusion stuff is it all kind of ends up looking the same, and it's pretty difficult to differentiate yourself. So this was my exploration of kind of the principles behind reaction diffusion to see if I couldn't find some way to make things a little bit more interesting, at least in my opinion. So this is the result. It shouldn't be a terribly long one today. It's actually pretty simple. And with that said, let's jump into things. So here's our overall network. We have our kind of inputs over here. We have our main reaction diffusion part of the feedback loop here. We have this other part of the feedback loop, which is adding some details and variety. And then that's pretty much it. So one big feedback loop, only one feedback top in here right at the beginning. Everything else is contained inside. So let's get rid of most of this. Actually, just get rid of all of it. And I'm going to start with a circle. So I think everyone probably has come across reaction diffusion in its most basic form at some point. So I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly. The way to replicate a pseudo reaction diffusion in TouchDesigner is by using a feedback and a blur and a sharpen, which you can get by hitting Control B, going to the image filters on the palette, and then grabbing the sharpen filter. Turn that amount up to 1, pass it in. We actually don't need a comp right now. Drop the null on the feedback. And now we can see that our reaction diffusion is already kind of working. I'll make the circle a bit bigger resolution, maybe 1024 by 1024. And this will give us something to start with. So, like I said, my principal goal here was to try and make things more interesting. So by using different blurs, we can get some different effects, but there's just not really a ton going on. And if we make it more high res, mess with the blur, we'll have something that looks a little bit more interesting, but at the end of the day, this isn't doing it for me. So a common thing to do then is maybe grab a noise instead. Throw a noise down. So I'm going to throw a keyboard in, just key 1, and drop that on my feedback chop. So then I can hit K1 and reset my feedback. Actually, I'm going to delete that, and I'm just going to start parameterizing our parent component. So let's drop all this down, jump inside of it, right-click, customize parent component, and just start parameterizing. So I'm going to drop my feedback reset on here. I'm going to go up a level again, and then here you can do two things. You can either drop down a keyboard in, a null, and then drop the null onto your reset like this. Or if you have a component somewhere else in your project that you use for your master reset, which is what I have, you can reference that here. So I use a local a local component with the shortcut of local, and I always just reference the pulse parameter from that component everywhere I go to keep things really easy, so that I know that that's the only place I have to worry about when I'm trying to pulse my entire project. But if you don't have one of those set up, then you can just use the keyboard in. Cool. So now we can hit 1 and reset. We can give our noise a bit more resolution. And okay, so things are getting a little bit better, but there's still not a lot of variation. And one thing that I always try and strive for is some variation across the screen, right? It's never super interesting if whatever you're looking at is just the same everywhere. So I'm going to move this actually to the other side. Sorry about that. And try and get it out of the background because I cannot work with the reaction diffusion on the background. A little bit too trippy. Okay. So now let's start adding a little bit of interest here. So one thing that we could do is something like using a luma blur instead of a regular blur, and having that luma blur maybe use our actual base to blur the different areas, black and white, differently. And you can see that already now things are starting to look a lot more interesting. And this is purely from using a luma blur instead of a regular blur. As you can see, my black filter width is 2, my white is 22, and if changing either of these really does change the makeup of our image. Maybe I'll set this noise with a period of 2, and I'll transform it with abs time dot seconds, or actually again, no, I'll customize my parent component. I will have a float parameter called time. I'm going to put my parameters right here so that I can also just access those handily. And I'll set the time parameter equal to abs time dot seconds times 0.01. And then I'll translate my noise with my time parameter times 0.5. Now, the reason I'm doing this is so that I can, at some point, use a different noise and set the translate parameter to time times a little bit of a different constant, and just have my noises translating at different times, but all relative to a master control to make it easier with audio activity, etc. Cool, so now we have some motion, we have some luma blur that's adding a lot of cool features and to our kind of topology here. I'm going to parameterize the black and white filter widths so that we can continue to play with them. We'll just label it luma white filter width and luma black filter width. And cool, it looks like we're cooking. Okay, so next maybe we want some ability to re-rack our input. And by that I just mean add a portion of it to our feedback loop. So I'm just going to drop down a level. I'm going to set the opacity to something like 0.05, then parameterize that. drag isn't working. Okay, maybe I won't. I'll just make it float, and then I'll change the label to base weight opacity. Maybe just base weight. And drag and drop that, and default it to 0.05. Then this null, which we named it for feedback, will go out here. I will use middle mouse to add a composite to the Luma blur, drag this in, change it to add, and then drag my comp into the null for feedback. And then change this null to PG and throw an out down at the very end, call it out. Yes. Cool. So already I'm really liking where things are going, but I think there's probably a little bit more that we can do. So maybe we can try and add some displace. Now, where to add something in a feedback loop is always a bit of a open question. There's no right answers. It's really stylistic and up to your specific taste. So, when I'm going through and kind of developing these, I'll try the feedback here, or sorry, I'll try the displace here or here. I think I tried it there, but I finally settled on I really like it after this composite. And so I'll put a displace here. First, what I'm going to do is actually use a alligator noise, which is something that I don't really think it's enough play because it looks really cool. I really love the organic textures to it. I'm going to make the offset 0, the amplitude 1, the exponent 0.5, and then I'm going to set the period to 4. So now we have some big, kind of large scale patterns. And I'll actually make the amplitude 2 so that we go from 0 to 1. Then we'll middle mouse, we'll drop a slope down. We're going to set the sample step to 21. And then the strength to something like 150. Yeah, maybe like 1. Okay, so that's why our noise resolution needs to be something much higher. I'm going to go with 2048 by 2048. It's worth noting that this is not a GPU-based noise, so you really don't want to be like translating this or anything, but if you're going to calculate it just once, it's fine. So now we want our slope strength to be something like 150, and our sample step to be something like 21. Now I'll wire this into my displace. I will make the displace weight something very small. And as I go with this, you can kind of see that we start to get this effect, which is as expected. But if we keep it really small and subtle, it tends to add, in my opinion, a pretty nice, just almost imperceptible something. Oops. So I'll leave that there for now. And then I'm going to do another displace. And this displace, I'm going to drop the first one into. We're going to select sorry about that, not select. We're going to then middle mouse on this displace and grab a slope, which is what we'll use to displace in the second displace. Our source midpoint is 0.5. I'm going to make the displace weight minus 0.1 here, and my UV weight, I'm going to drop down to 0.97. So now you can start to see more dynamism as you mess with the UV weight. Oh, sorry, this is all, my apologies. This needed to be wired into here. Okay, 0.997. And reset feedback. Cool. So now it's working as it was supposed to. You see the effects of our slope. So if I just bypass this displace, you can see that the effects of the slope are there, but it is subtle, which is what we want. And then this displace, you can see the effects of as well, much more obvious. And then the UV weight is what's doing that zoom. So you can zoom in or zoom out or do both. You know, use something like an LFO and knock yourself out. I like the kind of perpetual zoom out, so I'm going to leave it at 997. And then the weight, again, you can go either negative or positive. Different things are going to lead to different effects. I like the slightly darker look of having it be displaced with a negative weight. And you can do the same on our first displace if you want to experiment. You know, there are ways that you can, you can do anything you want. So I will put that at the same, minus 0.001 for my two displaces. Now you can see that things are looking pretty good. We have some fine details here. We have a lot of blurry regions here. The white's a little bit bright, so you can deal with that. And there's some detail that's getting lost in some of the corners. So we can try and work with that as well. One thing that we can do is just blur our slope a little bit. We can also try to change the sample step of our slope and make that a little bit higher. Have our slope strength go up. And now you can see that changing the sample step of the slope also has quite an impact. If I look at these parameters and maximize this, you can see that things are starting to look very interesting now that we're playing with the slope. We can down with some negative sample steps and higher sample or slope strengths. We're getting some of these cool tendril-like patterns, as well as just a lot of variation across the texture. Slope of 0 or a sample step of 0 is essentially like it's not there. And then as we go up in our sample step, it also kind of fades away in its effect because it's sampling such a great area that it's essentially just like noise. So there's a sweet spot, but inside of that sweet spot, you can play around to get some nice variation. So I'm going to leave the sample step around 3 for now because I like these tendril kind of long things. You could also, if you wanted, for example, look at sample steps that vary in different directions for some other levels of detail. Similar, using this blur is probably going to have some pretty noticeable effects because it's essentially just, applying that same transformation to the slope. I'm going to leave it set somewhere around 5 just to like smooth out some hard edges, especially because our next step is going to add a little bit more sharpness to our lines. So we are going to take our sharpen, copy and paste it, drag it down here, and wire in the displace. Now, if I just send this straight to here, you can see that it's somewhat chaotic. turning up the blur on our slope will help sort out some of this, but it's going to be pretty chaotic. So you'll probably want to turn down the sharpen amount quite a bit. I'm going to set it somewhere around 0.5. And then set this blur back to a pre-shrink of 1 and a filter of 5. So now you can see the effects of the sharpen. It's somewhat subtle, but when it's not there and you're looking for it, you can tell. And you can see that it gets these sharp areas, a lot more fine detail, and that's where the blur on the slope is going to come in handy. Then I'm going to drop down a matte, put this sharpen into the matte, wire the displace into the other input. Then I'm going to grab a copy of this noise, but I'm going to change the seed. I'm going to change the period and the exponent a little bit, just to give us something different. It's transforming. I'm going to transform it slower than our other noise. Wire that into the matte and make sure it's set to Luma. Then we'll put this into the displace here. And now we can see that our sharpen is affecting things, but only as much as the matte will allow. So this gives you another cool way to experiment and add another layer of just variation, interest, whatever you want to call it. You could also do something like add a totally different and very slow translation on the X. So now it's translating in multiple directions. That'll add a little bit more dynamism, and it'll probably be kind of unconscious, which is always fun. We can parameterize this sharpen amount. We'll call this sharpen 2 amount. This other one we're not going to parameterize though, because it needs to stay at 1. Everything will kind of break down if it's not. And then, I mean, this is already pretty cool. It's looking a lot more textured. There's a lot more variety. Pretty pleased with kind of the dispersion and balance. If we use a circle instead of our noise, we can... Whoa. So what's going on here? It sounds like we probably have a pixel format issue of some sort. And the resolution isn't the same. Interesting. All right, well, I messed something up. All right, so I put the pixels back into 8-bit fixed, all of them, and we're back to working. Some of the specific tops, like the displace, slope, and luma blur, I'm going to go back in and change to 16-bit float. Not 100% sure why it's tweaking out with the circle. Maybe my blur is just too high. Yeah, okay. So my blur parameter was just too high, which you will find some different inputs are going to require different parameters to kind of have their sweet spot and be able to function. Anyway, the last thing that I'm going to do here is add something a little bit bespoke that's going to give us a very cool finishing off effect. So that is going to be a convolve top. A convolve top. And the convolve top does something pretty interesting. It basically takes in a DAT, and that DAT is going to be a table. It's going to look like this. I have this just made. But you guys can quickly type this in. This table is for what's called the unsharp filter. You can find out more about that on Wikipedia. Unsharp masking. Can learn a lot about it as well as see different filters. So this is just one. It's actually a specific variation. There's tons, and if you're just on Wikipedia looking at different image convolutions, this is just a kernel. There's going to be a ton of them. All we have to do is drag that coefficient stat onto our convolve. And actually, the one thing we do have to do before that is normalize everything. So we're going to use a evaluate dat me.input cell dot value divided by minus 256 value, I think. That was it. There we go. Sorry, just me.input cell divided by negative 256, and that's just the net sum of all of the numbers here. We can drag this onto the convolve filter, and then if we wire an image in, it will apply this convolution kernel, which is essentially just a weighted average of a bunch of pixels, where it says for this pixel in the center, we'll sample it, we'll multiply it by this number, or really that number, and we'll sample all of the neighboring pixels with the corresponding weights, and change the resulting image to that color. So if I just replace with my convolve, you'll see that it's not doing what we want. And the reason for that is probably because our blur is super high. So if I, just bypass this blur, now you can see what's happening. So we're getting a lot more small detail, and we're getting some pretty like fine lines, which I really like. But us blurring too much is going to take this and really dull the effect of it. Even blurring just a little bit, if we see like, yeah, see even just having like 3 and 5 as our blur filter widths, it's already kind of just not really working. So what I'm gonna do is drop a Luma blur after this. I'm gonna wire the sharp now right into this Luma blur. I'm gonna take the same lookup texture, and then I'm just gonna set the black filter to 1, the white filter to 0. Middle mouse, drop a cross wire both of these in, drop that into the comp, and then customize our component and drop on this cross parameter, and we'll call this the unsharp sharp cross. I'm going to default it to 0.05, and we can reset. And now we can see that we're getting some of this cool kind of lots of variety. There's tons of variety. There's some sharp lines, there's some blurry lines, there's a little bit of everything, and it is a pretty cool effect, in my opinion. Now, what have we done? I think I messed something up. And it's fine. So let's see what's going on. Just do this. Oh, well, that could certainly be a large part of it. My base weight was very high up for some reason. Okay, let's try and put this back in. Okay, that's behaving a little bit better. One thing that we could think about doing is, instead of using a cross here, using a mat, and then wiring that other Luma blur in, and then maybe doing a using this noise actually to mat the two of them. We set it to Luma. Let's see how this looks. Let's see what the range is here by clicking on the viewer and hitting N. That's 0 to 1, so that's good. Because our luminance is supposed to take that value. We can see that there's a difference between the mat and the cross. It's just kind of up to you, I suppose, on which you prefer. I think both are pretty cool, but I think I kind of like the cross, actually, because it has more of the traits of both. But the mat is also cool, and you could do something perhaps more interesting by throwing a threshold down, grabbing the output of the blurred sharpen, and actually putting that in as the mat. If we then blur this a little bit, our mat is now going to be cut up by our output. And this is actually looking pretty cool because there's some really fine details right next to some very blurry areas, and I like that a lot. So I will leave that there for now. Very cool. Clean this up just a little bit. Collapse, call this unsharp. I will I'll just keep the cross up there. We might switch it back out later. I'll leave that there for now. Cool. So we can put some finishing touches on this side. We can maybe see what it looks like if we put this after the displace. Something like this. Feedback. That is looking pretty good. Looks like. Okay, and we'll just wire this into our background. So I think I like that after. Cool. So that is great. One other thing we can do is, because this is a noise, if we want to add a little bit of variety, we can add another noise here, change the seed, make the period higher, transform it with our parameter times, I don't know, 0.3. And make the output input minus noise, and the noise scale something very small. And that will just give a little bit of variety across our luma blurs, since it's not going to be exactly the same as our. Actually, if you do input times noise, that's probably more interesting. Yeah, mess around with that. I think I like times. To just make it a function of the input, but not exactly the same. And we could do that to this mat as well. Or we could make this mat a function of the feedback too. So maybe what I'll do is actually take the threshold of the feedback ran through the noise, and I'll do this one as our input minus noise with our noise scale. Actually, something like that. Like a 1, because we wanted to kind of take out a solid chunk here. So we'll soften up our threshold a little bit. We'll wire that into the mat, and we'll hit reset. And I think that's probably pretty much it. We just straighten things up a little bit. Can decide whether we want to use this cross, which looks like this, or our mat, which looks like that. Or maybe what I'll do is just take the mat itself and actually cross that with just the blurred sharpen, which is already in there. And so now the mat's always going to be applied, and it's really more about the weight, which we can use the cross for. So now even when it's really high, we're only getting a little bit of extra texture, and that's because of the mat that we're applying. We probably want to apply that noise trick here too, because our texture gets pretty dense once it gets populated. So we can copy and paste this noise actually, and just use the same one. But instead of making it times, I'll make it minus. And then now I'm going to try and clean up all of this. So our feedback's in there. So I'm going to basically take all of this and drop all of this down. What did I miss? Just fix all of these. Go back up. Get my network in order. We can call this sharp, unsharp. Application. We have our two displace loops here. So maybe I will collapse all of this. Well, I'll collapse our displacing. Displace passes. And then I will get rid of this. And we'll call this post sharpen. And I'll just have to update these references. And again, just make sure that we're using different seeds for all of our noises. Very good. And there we have it. That is pretty much the effect. We're left with a reaction diffusion that is looking pretty good, I would say, and will really let us play around with a lot of different things. I think it would be awesome to make this audio reactive and see just kind of what happens. And there's just so many different filters and parameters to play around with. And each of them, especially as they're changing, can really give rise to some pretty cool patterns. So I think one way to take this further would be to kind of focus on designing ways for these parameters to change and interact with each other, so that as they're changing, some really cool patterns and dynamic emergent effects materialize. So maybe a topic for another day. But for now, I will say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. And like always, just means so much to me from you guys. So continuously thank you. And I hope everybody enjoyed this. I'll see you next time.